China's two sessions are well underway, with economic growth and stability topping the agenda. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The annual meetings of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference and the National People's Congress have begun in Beijing. The two sessions, as they're more commonly known, set the stage for party members and delegates to discuss and implement domestic and foreign policies. Earlier, I spoke with the former U.S. Ambassador Chaz Freeman, who was the principal interpreter during President Nixon's historic visit to China in 1972. Ambassador Freeman discussed the current state of China-U.S. relations.
Well, I think they're very bad, the balloon incident evoked a reaction from the United States, which was semi-hysterical, and that resulted in the cancellation of Secretary of State Blinken's visit to Beijing, demonstrating that we have a great deal of difficulty talking to each other in the midst of a crisis. We don't really seem to know how to manage this relationship, and it is becoming ever more tense. I think we need to get together and talk, but that isn't happening.
What do you think needs to happen? I mean, was it a mistake for Secretary Blinken to cancel that visit?
I think so. It was a political decision based on American domestic politics, not based on judgments about statecraft or what would best serve the interests of the United States or China. I think it was a mistake. And I think Mr. Blinken said that he planned to visit China when circumstances permit. But the circumstances that prevented the visit were domestic political circumstances. And there's no sign that those are going to improve anytime soon.
If we look at the relationship in the last decade or so, we had President Obama, who adopted the pivot to Asia strategy or doctrine, which was switching the focus, or the American foreign policy focus, from Europe and the Middle East to Asia. Then, of course, President Trump came into office, and relations went downhill when he was in office. He introduced tariffs against Russian imports. So what have all these measures done, and how have they impacted the relationship?
Well, I think they've had a very deleterious effect on the relationship. It's notable that during this entire period, China has tried to keep the door open to dialogue. It's the United States that has retreated from it. I think that is a mistake. And it has put us in a position where we are at odds on an increasing number of issues. I think there is a problem in that the way the relationship is described now in the United States is that it's competitive almost entirely, but there might be a few things on which we could cooperate. I think that reverses the logical order and the effective order. It should be described as we should cooperate, and of course we'll also compete where that's appropriate.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about the Chinese economy. China has just revised its economic target for 2023, predicting growth of 5%. And that is a number that's going to be very closely watched, because China is seen as the main driver of growth around the globe right now. What do you make of that target, and where do you see the Chinese economy growing?
I think it's actually a conservative target. I mean, the early performance of the Chinese economy in 2023, the rebound after the shutdowns, the lockdowns of the COVID pandemic were over, has been very rapid. China has many problems. We're going to watch during the National People's Congress and Chinese People's Political Consultative Committee deliberations to see how the new economic team that is being put in place plans to address China's problems. But I take the 5% figure as relatively conservative.
The former Chilean ambassador to China, Jorge Heine, who now teaches here in the United States, he said during an interview with the Spanish newspaper El País, he said the U.S. market is closed. Decoupling from China may gain momentum in the long term, but not in the short term. So does decoupling make sense to you in any way? I mean, can the U.S. afford to do that? And on the other hand, I mean, wouldn't it make more sense for these countries to actually work together?
Well, I think it would make much more sense for the two to work together. I think the decoupling process basically impoverishes and retards growth in both societies. And I'm particularly concerned that decoupling in the area of high technology is likely to be injurious to my own country, the United States, because China now is a major power in the area of technological innovation. We have a great deal to gain by working with Chinese scientists, engineers, mathematicians, and the like, and a great deal to lose by cutting ourselves off from that cooperation.
The thing is, Ambassador, every time we look at technological progress, it's seen mainly here in the United States as a sort of zero-sum game, that if one country makes progress, it's seen as a threat, as a national security threat to the United States. I mean, how does one change that?
I wish I knew. I think it requires a level of leadership and education of the public that I don't see happening. It is, I think, a wrong judgment. It basically reduces technology to its military applications. And here too, I would say, the United States has deployed forces along China's borders. I'm not aware of any Chinese forces deployed along our borders. So the threat is not to the United States, but to American global primacy. And that is happening not because of a military challenge, but because China is returning to the wealth and power that it had through the millennium. And the United States is having a difficult time recognizing that we must now share the leadership of global affairs with other countries, among them China.
We've also seen how the conflict in Ukraine has been the source of increasing tensions between the United States and China. China has, of course, adopted a neutral position, and that has been interpreted here in the United States as support for Russia. It's led to allegations, unfounded, that China is considering supplying weapons to Russia. There's been no evidence of that. But China, at the same time, has also presented a 12-point peace plan to try and resolve that conflict. I mean, what do you make of that peace plan? Do you see it being a good basis for negotiation?
Well, China has taken a position which is actually quite similar to the one that other countries like India, that is, countries in the so-called global South, have taken. Wanting to see an early end to this war rather than its continuation. I don't think the 12 points that the Chinese government put forward constitute a plan. They are a set of principles which could give birth to a plan. But for a plan to come about, there would have to be a European initiative, perhaps in conjunction with China, to find a way of executing, implementing the principles, which seem to me to be incontrovertible. I suppose we'll see in April, when the French President Emmanuel Macron visits Beijing, whether Europe intends to try to produce a plan in cooperation with China.
Ambassador Chaz Freeman, thanks for joining us, sir.
My pleasure.
Now, as we continue our conversation on the two sessions, we take a look at the figures from China's government work report. Beijing has set its sights on increasing gross domestic product by 5%, as we mentioned, in 2023. CGTN's Zheng Junfeng has details.
The government work report says China aims to expand its economy by around 5% in 2023. That will certainly lead the world economy. China targets inflation rate of around 3% for 2023. That compares to 2% inflation in 2022. That implies that the price rises will be demand-driven as the economy recovers rather than due to a flood of liquidity. China aims to create around 12 million urban jobs in 2023 and targets a surveyed urban unemployment rate of around 5.5%. The country also aims to keep its grain output over 650 million tons in 2023. Food security is crucial for this country with 1.5 billion people. China's deficit to GDP ratio is projected at 3% for 2023, slightly higher than 2.8% last year, giving more leeway for fiscal support. The energy consumption per unit of GDP and the discharge of major pollutants in China will continue declining this year. This is part of China's green development effort. China will intensify efforts to attract and utilize foreign investment. And China will expand market access, continue to open up the modern services sector, ensure national treatment for foreign-funded companies, improve services for foreign-funded companies, and facilitate the launch of landmark foreign-funded projects, said the report. The report has covered many areas of high-quality development, such as green development, public services, and social welfare, as well as support to private businesses, innovation, technology upgrade, rural revitalization. So the government is not eyeing short-term growth, but rather long-term sustainable growth through 2035 and 2050, when China aims to build itself into a modernized country.
That was Zheng Junfeng reporting from Beijing. Well, for more on this, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Oregon, Liang is a professor of economics at Willamette University out of Shanghai. Josef Gregory Mahoney is a professor of politics and international relations at East China Normal University in Shanghai. And from Beijing, we're joined by Anna Tangen. He is a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asia Narratives. Welcome to all of you. Anna Tangen, these two annual meetings are well underway, and we just heard our reporter there give us the basic headings of what the meetings will be focusing on: economic growth, new urban jobs, green development, and rural revitalization. What are you expecting to come out of this?
Well, I mean, it was the work report is interesting because last year about 3/4 of it was dealing with what was going to be happening in the future. This time around, there was 25 pages basically on what had happened in the past and only 6 pages going forward. But it was very moderate. Beijing has adopted a kind of let's wait and see tone. There are obviously a tremendous number of headwinds, especially with the competition. And, you know, I think Ambassador Freeman gave it an excellent analysis, very balanced. And that's basically what China is trying to project. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily what the United States is interpreting from it.
And when you talk about those headwinds, Anna, would that main challenge be the relationship with the United States?
Yeah, well, yes. In a nutshell, obviously the conflict in Ukraine figures highly. So does global warming, the debt situation, especially with developing countries. You know, the low, very, very low economic growth numbers that are coming out of Europe and the United States, which are centers of demand. You know, these are things that are going to affect China in the long run. You know, I mean, over this last part of the year. And China really does have to look to domestic demand in order to kind of push things up a bit.
Liang, I want to focus a little bit more on that 2023 work report. As we discussed with Ambassador Chaz Freeman, China is looking at a target of 5% GDP for this year. The NPC deputy said to obtain that kind of growth, China needs to boost people's confidence in social development, boost consumption, and attract investment. What do you make of that?
Right. So I think the growth target is, you know, a feasible one. But also, I think it reflects the sobering analysis of, you know, the external uncertainties and challenges. When we look at the numbers for the first 2 months, we have seen really fast expansion of factory activities. The PMI in manufacturing has recorded the highest reading since 2012. And we have also seen the 100 largest real estate developers has recorded a 15% of sales increase. And this is the first time in 20 months. So what that says is I think China is on a good trajectory to rebound and recover from the COVID. And we're likely to see, economic growth. But that said, I think for one, yes, domestic consumption demand still needs to be boosted, not only by strengthening and stabilizing the real estate market, but also creating more jobs and income. And on the other hand, I think also that external environment need to be cautioned against. But finally, I think it's important to understand, as your reporter pointed out, China is not looking for a short-term spurt of growth, but rather really conform to that long-term high-quality growth goal, sustainable development goal. So I think all these are really reflected in these growth targets, inflation targets, and also proactive fiscal policy and prudent monetary policy.
And Liang, I mean, getting back to growth, we heard Ambassador Chaz Freeman tell us there that he thinks that 5% that's being talked about is actually conservative. Do you agree with that?
I think in some sense, yes. We look at, 29 out of the 31 provinces and autonomous regions prior to the two sessions have forecasted their own growth to be over 5%. Only Beijing and Tianjin had a number that is slightly below 5%. So I think what it means is that, I think national the provinces, they do have the confidence to grow at, over 5%. Some are even higher, 6 or 7%. But that said, again, I think this sends a very important message to policymakers at the local level, which is, we need to be cautious about not stimulating or overstimulating the economy, and also not to put the stability, right, the regulations, and also some other priorities, inclusive growth and also sustainable growth to the back burner. So it's important to understand that long-term and more comprehensive goal rather than having a very ambitious growth target.
Josef, Gregory, Mahoney, let's talk about the plan for rural revitalization. That's one of the big headlines out of these two sessions. This is what Professor Rana Mitter, who is Professor of International Relations at Oxford University, had to say about that. Let's listen.
The rural areas have to be part of that change. And so concentrating on rural revitalization, which includes education, providing more basic services, and also redistributing tax revenues and incomes to the countryside. These are all going to be key tasks for the authorities in the next few years.
So, Josef, how does development of the country's rural areas fit into the broader economic strategy here?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it's one of the it's clearly something that has always been a central message during Xi Jinping's time in power, and we've seen, of course, already over the last 10 years monumental achievements in revitalizing the countryside. I think the big question, obviously, as the professor from Oxford noted, for China to continue to grow, to hit its 2035 and 2050 growth targets, the rural areas have to be developed. They have to play a big role. And of course, this is also consistent with the goal to achieve Chinese socialism and bringing social justice, economic justice to everyone, including the people in the countryside. But I think the big question this year is the extent to which the government will be moving to stimulate growth primarily in the cities where it can concentrate policies, fiscal and monetary policies, where it can help achieve that goal of reaching 12 million urban jobs and keeping the surveyed urban unemployment rate around 5.5%. So there are some questions about whether or not we may see more emphasis on city growth this year, especially big city growth, so that we can leverage those gains, as we've done in the past in China, where we had some places get rich first, and then we reinvest these and develop other areas. But I don't think we're going to see a wholesale drop in efforts to revitalize. In fact, I'll be going to a conference in a couple of weeks in a rural area in Yunnan to discuss the importance, the vitality of advancing green development in the countryside to help support overall national development. So this is clearly still a major impetus, and I think we'll have to see how it plays out over the course of this challenging year of economic recovery.
All right, Joseph, as far as green development is concerned, do you see the big rollout in rural areas?
Well, I think one of the things that has fascinated me, and I've been to many rural areas over the past year, is the clear focus on local leaders, and they show it again and again, of the responsibility they have for the local environment. That there are, independent national government testing groups that come down to make sure that the water is clean, that the air is clean, and the local officials are held personally responsible for this. And at the same time, we have local officials who are held personally responsible for poverty, for helping people get out of poverty, advising them, helping them leverage government programs to create some sort of sustainable path forward. And what I really see are these two initiatives really intersecting, not only to support the development of these local rural areas, but to contribute to overall healthy national growth.
Young Liang, what's your assessment of China's shift to developing the green economy? I mean, is it firmly on track? Is the country meeting its targets?
Yeah, I just want to add one more point. I think the rural revitalization, it's always also very, very important for China's food security and food sovereignty. So I think that's been always emphasized, that we need to modernize the agricultural sector, the rural area. Not only that's the way to improve domestic consumer demand and also provide the equitable opportunities for the rural residents, but it's also very vital for food security. Now talking about this idea of green development, and I think what in the government's work report and also in the media exchange later with the Ministry of Industrial and Information, I think what they're trying to do is really to focus on the key industries such as construction, non-ferrous metals, and steel. So some of the key sectors, they're setting the peaking carbon emission targets. So really trying to focus on some of these highly polluting and highly energy intensive industries. And the second point, of course, is as they stressed, is that we need to develop the green technologies in order to really strengthen and improve the energy intensity. So I think those are really important messages from the two sessions.
Anna Tang and the international community is watching very closely China's success in things like technology, in poverty alleviation, as well as food security. We heard our reporter tell us that there is a big focus on food security, and that's totally understandable. We're talking about a country of 1.3 billion people here. Here's Lina Luna, the Colombian scholar in Asian affairs. Let's listen to what she had to say about those things.
China clearly is moving forward towards a more sustainable and quality development with this concept of Chinese-style modernization. And when we look at Chinese perspective on how development should work, the first concept that comes out is that of a balance between material growth and spiritual growth.
So listening to her there, Anna, what do you make of what she had to say? I mean, can these strategies also be implemented in other countries?
Oh, well, yes, overall, I mean, they're not going to exactly copy China, and nor is China trying to figure out a way to have them do so. It's really about the lessons that China has done. I mean, you look at the latest statistics, well over 80% of the high-tech areas that are going to be in competition, China is ahead. This kind of belies this untruth that somehow China is copying. You can't copy when you're ahead. And domestic politics are really the issue in the United States. It's the perception of China, not the reality. The reality is the U.S. should be rooting for China to do well, because it could very much help the U.S., especially in the area of exports and global trade. So, at this juncture, these countries, especially the global South, and I note you had two commentators from that area, are saying, look, the Chinese model is more attractive. It's both humane and economically feasible. And this kind of balance is very attractive. So it's not necessarily an ideology. It's a question of how you arrange your policies and your priorities.
Joseph, Gregory, Mahoney, let's talk about one other development, and that is the defense budget is going to be increased by 7.2%. I mean, in the general scheme of things, that's a pretty hefty increase. What's the significance of that?
Well, I think if we do put it in perspective, it's not that big of an increase. The U.S. It's really just over a quarter of the U.S. Spending on military. Plus, we saw the Japanese military budget is expected to expand this year by 26%. The Korean budget, the way they budget is a little bit differently, but we expect somewhere around 5%. So if we look at the way the United States is devoting more of its military resources and more of its military posturing against China, that means a greater proportion of that 800 billion is being directed at China. And if we see how the United States is now trying to leverage South Korea and Japan into these sort of bloc alliances, as well as Australia and others, then we have to say that the Chinese increase is in fact very, very modest. It's still single digit after many years. The only thing that I think people have pointed to is that it's outpacing the annual growth rate, but I see this as merely incidental to the difficulties that we expect with economic recovery.
So, Joseph, in terms of security policy, then what do you see as China's priority?
Well, here I think that the focal point has to be the white paper that we saw recently released on the Global Security Initiative. I think this is fulfilling what President Xi has been talking about over several years, about China becoming a global peacemaker and above all, leading peace initiatives starting in Asia. But of course, what we saw was this report, or this work report published, outlining key principles, key values, things like indivisible security, again with a global focus. But then a few days later, we saw the 12-point proposal for resolving the conflict, or at least initiating negotiations to resolve the conflict in Ukraine. So I think what we're seeing now is China really starting to mature and step up as a global leader, as someone who's going to try to help create worldwide peace, as opposed to trying to lead things like decoupling or lead the world into a new Cold War.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.